intro of our formal welcome in a couple of moments. Welcome, friends. My name is Lena Blunt. I'm the Education Coordinator at Pendle Hill. I am so excited to welcome you tonight for our November First Monday lecture with Brent Bill. I'll be your MC for the evening, and I'd like to just orient you a little bit to how we do these First Mondays, and then I'll say some more about Brent, and we'll enter into some worship, out of which Brent will deliver his message. You may have noticed that we are streaming this video live on YouTube. The video that will be visible on YouTube will only be of myself and Brent and potentially Francisco during the question and answer, but most participants' faces will not be seen. However, if you would like to turn off your video or are not comfortable with your face on the screen, I invite you to consider doing that. Live transcript is also enabled, so you can access the closed captioning on your side if you like. We disable the chat for these lectures so that participants can really focus and receive the message. During our question and answer at the end, you can send your questions into the chat to me, and then I will read them aloud for Brent. This allows us to consolidate similar questions, to see where there are themes, and also just to help facilitate a smooth question and answer at the end. So that's enough about some of the logistics. I would love to just take a moment to welcome you into the experiment that is Pendle Hill. We've been doing these First Monday lectures online for the pandemic, and I invite you all to consider joining us online also for our morning worship, which we've been doing hybrid, both in person in the barn and online every morning at 8:30 a.m. Eastern. Pendle Hill was founded over 91 years ago as an experiment in faithfulness and community and education, and you all are joining us in that experiment tonight, so thank you for joining us. I'm excited to introduce Brent Bill. He's a member of Spirituality and Practices Living Spiritual Teachers Project. He's a lifelong Quaker who has published more than 20 books, including Life Lessons from a Bad Quaker, A Humble Stumble Towards Simplicity and Grace, Sacred Compass, The Way of Spiritual Discernment, and Holy Silence, The Gift of Quaker Spirituality. Brent is also a photographer, retreat leader, and writing coach, and he lives on a plowshare farm in Indiana. I'm so excited, Brent, to have you join us tonight and speak to us on hope in despair. I invite us all to settle into silent contemplative worship. Out of the silence, Brent, please speak as you are led.
Well, good evening, friends. I hope you can hear me okay. It's good to be with you all, even though it's virtually. As I was telling Lena and Francisco before we began, and John Meyer, who I see is online, will remember this. The last time I gave a Monday night lecture was about a year and a half ago, in January of 20, for my new book then, and I had laryngitis that night. I hadn't had it before, but I got it that afternoon, and it was a less than satisfactory experience, I think, for the attenders and certainly for me. And so even though I was invited to get my booster shot today for COVID, I declined till Thursday to make sure nothing happened like that tonight. So, well, I really appreciate you all taking time to join and listen to me share a bit, and hopefully have some questions or comments towards the end about the new book, Hope and Witness in Dangerous Times, which is this little book. It's one of the Quaker Quicks series, which is a series published by John Hunt Publishing in England, although they're an international publisher, and they're all very short books, 20,000 words about some aspect of Quaker life and witness in the world today. So I was pleased to that Jennifer Kavanaugh, one of my English friends, really invited me to address this topic. And this topic started for me as a workshop that I led for College Park quarterly meeting of Pacific yearly meeting a few years ago. It's the book had its genesis is that way, but it's something I've thought about for a long time. What it means to have hope and witness in a world. What is this combination of witness and spirituality, activism and spiritual life? Partly that's because I grew up among evangelical friends. That was the tradition I grew up in Ohio. And a lot of emphasis was placed there on our own spiritual lives and very little on activism. And yet, and I knew other friends in our other traditions were placing lots of emphasis on activism. And it seemed to me folks were asking us to do an either or. We either do activism or we do spirituality. How do we blend these things? It seemed to me was an important sort of thing to look at. And over the years, I've been, one of the things I am is a inveterate quote collector. And one that I read, and I know this is problematic in some ways today, knowing is something that William Penn said. We certainly know his shortcomings, but he did say this quote that I thought was really powerful, and I've used it, and many of us know the first part of it, and that's the one that says, true godliness doesn't turn us out of the world, but enables us to live better in it and excites our endeavors to mend it. And a lot of times we stop there, but the quote goes on to say, and this is sort of antique language, but Christians should keep the helm and guide the vessel to its port, not meanly steal out at the stern of the world and leave those that are in it without a pilot to be driven by the fury of evil times upon the rock or sand of ruin. And so as I continue after that quote in the book, I say, I invite you to consider how your faith life better enables you to live in these dangerous times and how it moves you to work at mending the world. How do your spiritual beliefs empower you to help guide the vessel of the world and its people in a good and safe direction? And the book starts with a quick look at some Quaker history, because again, Quaker quicks are written for folks primarily who are not friends, who want to learn more about us. And so I talk about how if faith matters, it has to matter in the time we live in. And for the early friends, that certainly was true. And all their stances, it seems to me, from my study of friends over the years, is that all of their, what we now call the testimonies, were really rooted in their understanding of what it meant to be a Christian, and their reading of the Bible, and then what they considered the recovery of primitive Christianity. They often called it primitive Christianity revived. And because I am the person I am, I always say, well, it was more like primitive Christianity revised, because they revised it to their worldview. But all those things were not abstractions. They didn't just spring out as we know them today. And I give examples in the book about that. But one else I'll highlight today especially is this idea of the peace testimony as we know it. You know, the first public statement that's well known today is what's called, because they didn't believe in short titles, a declaration from the harmless and innocent people of God called Quakers to King Charles II in 1660. And in it, they state, all bloody principles and practices we as to our own particulars do utterly deny, with all outward wars and strife and fightings with outward weapons, for any end or under any pretense whatsoever. And this is our testimony to the whole world. And then they go on at length, citing the Bible and their spiritual beliefs to support this petition to the king. And now, in all Quaker honesty and integrity, since that's one of our testimonies, I have to say, this wasn't just a statement against war and fighting. It was written in no small part to put distance between them and people like the Fifth Monarchy men and other English radicals who really were talking about putting together armies to march on London and overthrow the government. And hence, there's that harmless and innocent phrase in the title. So they're stating their position, but they're also trying to separate from others. But I still think this form is the best, that the best of Quaker activism has followed even to this day, that social action, whether against Trident submarines being based in Britain or immigrant families being separated at the United States southern border, is rooted in more than a vague do-goodism. It's a tree that springs from a deeply planted spiritual seed, and it bears fruit. It's something that can be clearly stated in the religious principles that fertilize it. And like a tree, it continues to grow and change throughout its seasons, if it's to provide shade and fruit, that is. And we know that the peace testimony has evolved from that original declaration, which is one of the other things, is our hope and witness must fit our times. We have to continue to look and see how we speak to this world. What good news have we got to say to a world that's hurting and needy? In the next section of the book, I start trying to draw from some lessons from Quaker history and today. And some of these lessons include, for friends, it seems to me that our life and witness need to be rooted in the life of the Spirit. it's too easy to just move beyond that and not be grounded. Another is that we have our blind spots. And I'm going to say more about that later as well. Also, I think one of the lessons that friends have taught us over the years is that spiritually based activism is rarely confined to just one topic. While we know some friends in the past for certain work, you think of John Woolman, who's known best for his efforts to eradicate slavery. He was also concerned about Native American issues of his day, care of the earth, and peace work. He had a blended testimony that was deeply rooted in his life of the spirit. Another lesson I think that we have learned is that worship is an amazing anchor for spiritual activism. We all know, or many of us know, the story of Rufus Jones, Robert Yarnell, and George Walton's visit to Nazi Germany, and then holding meeting for worship in Gestapo headquarters, and that being the reason that they were allowed in even to speak to the officials instead of just being kept in that waiting room. It was because they didn't sit and chit chat. They had this power that centered them and was something that was evidently evident to the people who were eavesdropping because they knew the room was bugged. Another in our modern life, I think of the way Equate, the Quaker Action Team, has worked in their activities and often holding worship in board meetings of the people whose minds they were trying to change or outside their branch offices of PNC, etc. So it's an amazing anchor for this work that we may feel called to do. Another one that I think is super important is that spiritual activism has to go beyond partisanship. And I'm just going to read a section from this because I think it's really important. I write, it's easy to get involved when a particular person whose policies, attitudes, and actions offends us come into power. We get heated up and work against that person. But when power is restored to the correct side, according to us, we fade away. We lose interest. That's because for many of us, it's hard to sustain work that's based on anger, hate, and partisanship. This is true in the era of Donald Trump in the US. Many progressives, including people of faith, were incensed by his immigration policies, rightly so. But many of those same people of faith were somewhat quiet when some of the same things were occurring during President Obama's administration. We liked Barack Obama, and so we gave him a pass. True hope and faithful witness have to be consistent across party lines, no matter who is in power. Such work is easier to maintain if our hope and witness are rooted in that which is deeper than indignation, abhorrence, or hatred of a particular person in power. Another lesson is that spiritual activism among friends and others, I believe, must have love as its prime motivation, not hatred or upsetness, but love. When woman was asked why he was going to take time off to visit the Native Americans in Western Pennsylvania in a time of real distress, we all know the first part of his quote: love was the first motion. And thence a concern arose to spend time with the Indians. But what follows is what's most important. Because of love, he says, that I might feel and understand their life and the spirit they live in. If haply I might receive some instruction from them. And then last it says, or they might in any degree by help forward by my following the leadings of truth among them. I mean, he didn't go because he was going to help these poor, unenlightened people. That he didn't go out of a sense of superiority. He went because love moved him to go. And his first two things is he would feel and understand the life and spirit they live in, and then he might learn from them. How do we do our activism in such a way that love is our motion to do that and actually learn something about the life and the spirit, even our political or the people making policies that we oppose to who are on the other side? How can we learn from them because of love? That's a hard one, I think, to put into practice. And one of my examples of that is John Lampin's work and his wife's work in Ireland during the Troubles, and meeting with people from both sides to try and understand the life that they were living in. Love was the first motion. One of my favorite quotes is by Roger Wilson, a British friend who says we need to be God's plumbers, channeling cisterns of living water. I never thought of myself as witnesses plumbing, as someone who in high school, my very first job was as a plumber's assistant and carrying tools. By the end of that summer at 50 cents an hour, I knew that I did not particularly feel called to be a plumber. But Roger Wilson's statement makes me think about that. Working on tanks and channels for the living water that can quicken the daily life of men and women. And he goes on to say, 17th century friends were good plumbers, in and out of season, in and out of jail, in and out of court, counting house and farmstead. They challenged the conventions of the day in politics, in commerce, in the law, the established church, social etiquette, in education, in attitudes to war, poverty, and crime. Another is, one of the lessons I believe is that we must continue to work in community and from community and not alone. It's too easy for me to want to run off and follow my leadings, and as the early friends say, outrun my guide, and instead of testing my leadings with my community, my faith community. British friend Rhiannon Grant reminds us that we are not a do-it-yourself religion. We are a do-it-ourselves religion. Or you like that? We're not a do-it-yourself religion. We're a do-it-ourselves religion. Although no special person or object, she says, is needed to access divine wisdom, Quakers also admit the possibility that any individual might be mistaken, perhaps led astray by their personal desires. It's the group, not just the individual, which seeks to find the will of God. The one that, the line in that quote that really stings me, of course, is the one that says, admit the possibility that any individual, which includes me, might be mistaken. And so that centering of community, tied with all those other things of worship and so forth, are really important. Another important lesson, I believe, is that we need to remember that we must be good while we do good. And I have a whole chapter on that, but it's an important lesson. One of the dangers of doing good is trying to just do the good in our own power, not relying on the Spirit to guide us and help us. And when we do that, I think we forget the reality that our witness and activism then actually reflect the values of our interior lives. And what I mean by that is we may say we're for peace, but if we're not acting peacefully, what does that show about how dear we hold the peace testimony? How do we make sure that the values we proclaim in our activism are ones that we really hold? And how the ones that we really hold manifest themselves in to people who are observing us. What do they see in how we are? A Quaker, Joe Vellacourt, writes, the people whom I know who live a truly nonviolent life are in touch with the source of power. Call it what you will, the light, the seed, God, the Holy Spirit. And this tending of our spiritual lives as we do our witness, however we're called to do it, helps us avoid what Thomas Merton once called, and in this statement, he's referencing some words of the well-known Quaker Douglas Steere. How do we avoid the pervasive form of contemporary violence to which the idealist most easily succumbs? Activism and overwork. Being rooted in maintaining our spiritual lives and being good while doing good helps us avoid the pervasive form of contemporary violence to which the idealist most easily succumbs, activism and overwork. Another lesson, and I said I was going to mention this and go into it a bit more, is that we do have our blind spots. And in that way, we are like the friends who have preceded us. We look at William Penn. We can look at George Fox even, who did not outrightly condemn slavery, and have to realize that in some ways we have our shortcomings now by virtue of living in the times that we do and being shaped by our worldviews. We too could be blinded, as enlightened as we hope we are, by societal norms and attitudes. And that's not an excuse for our attitudes and actions now any more than it was or is for those Quakers who went before us. But it is a fact. As British Quaker Eva Pinthas says, the duty of the Society of Friends is to be the voice of the oppressed, but also to be conscious that we ourselves are part of that oppression. Uncomfortably, we stand with one foot in the kingdom of this world and with the other in the eternal kingdom. I have a really dear friend who grew up Lutheran and is still a Lutheran. His father was a Lutheran pastor, and he and I have often had discussions about Lutheran theology versus Quaker theology. Part of that is because he also married a Quaker. But in his growing up, and his attitude was there was the heavenly kingdom and the earthly kingdom, and they didn't ever intersect. And we Friends, I think, believe that we are, like, as Eva says, one foot in the kingdom of this world and the other in the eternal kingdom. So even while we're doing good, we must always keep in mind that we are not perfect. We need to take time to examine how our attitudes. I'll personalize this. I need to take time to always examine how my attitudes are influenced by my position in society. And how do I witness out of those and around them and through them, through the changing power of Spirit working through me? And I think that we do well to remember that future generations will also have insights and societal norms that are going to make ours seem lacking. So that being the case, we always must undertake our work with humility and a re-examination of our motives, our ideals, and our understandings. It's a constant re-examination of my motives is important one for me to remember. Why am I moved to do this? Does any of it have to do with the first motion being love? Or does my motive have to do with just the anger that I have about a situation? I'm not saying anger is bad. I'm saying, but what's my motive? And how do I channel righteous anger and work for justice? Another lesson, and I know some people hate this acronym, but I include it in the book, is the Quaker acronym of SPICES. If Joan Broadfield's on this, and I can't see everybody who's on, but Joan and I have disagreed about this for years. She finds them too much shorthand, and I find them too much. I find them very easy to explain to non-Quakers what some of our core beliefs really are, core ways of living. And I see them as not some kind of quirky add-on, but rather what we understand about how we're to live out the gospel in our daily lives, how we're to be the good news individually and corporately. And they are, and SPICES, I also think is good because if we put them in to play and use them and see them as SPICES, they will season our hope and witness, just like spices do. Those testimonies are ingredients that add savor and flavor to our witness. I mean, I can make a nutritious meal, and ever since I've always liked to cook, but I do most of the cooking now since my wife had a stroke almost 2 years ago. And but there was always a big difference between how she and I cooked. She was a good Indiana farm girl, pretty much meat and potatoes and good farm food, but not lots of spices, where I was somebody who was always experimenting with this, that, and the other. Capers. I love capers. You know, there are all kinds of things I like to throw in and say, well, let's see how this goes. And to find that, you know, I can be fed with a meal without spices and it gives me energy, but to really enjoy it, you know, to have a well-seasoned meal that includes spices, especially since I'm not allowed salt anymore, that's really cool. And it makes it great for the people I'm serving it to. And so I do explore how in the book that regardless what we're called to do, whether we're called to work for peace, care for the earth, immigration reform, diversity and equity, whatever, each of those spices need to be present in that work in some degree. It's hard to be peaceful if you're not practicing some simplicity and care of the earth, or care about diversity and equity issues. And we can look at all those about how these spices really need. And the spices are simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, equity, and stewardship of the earth. That's how I define them. And I think we're kind of agreed. So, and by using these spices, we create, I believe, in the words, again, he's not a Quaker, but the Dominican priest and theologian, Gustavo Gutierrez, a theology which does not stop with reflecting on the world, but rather tries to be a process through which the world is transformed. It's a theology which is open in the protest against trampled human dignity, in the struggle against the plunder of the vast majority of people, in liberating love, and in building a new, just, and fraternal society to the gift of the kingdom of God. And so, to use his words slightly, the spices are a Quaker gift to the kingdom, and I would change that to kingdom, the family, the people of God. Another section of the book, and again, this is a very short book, and I know I'm talking fast, but I want to cover some of the main points, is I have a chapter on being for. It has been my experience in the Society of Friends for now 70 years, although the first few years, I'll admit, I wasn't that aware as a friend, that we Quakers often define ourselves about what we're against or what we are not. So often I have heard Quakers, well, we are non-clerical. We don't have clergy. We don't have ritual. We don't have priests. We don't have communion. We don't do baptism. Now, of course, I would argue that we do with those spiritual ways but we first start out by what we're not. And too often also we define our work about what we're not for, what we're against. And another person who I read this quote years ago, and I've loved ever since, Oscar Romero, really spoke to my condition when he said, I don't want to be an anti against anybody. I simply want to be a builder of a great affirmation, the affirmation of God who loves us and who wants to save us. I want to be the builder of a great affirmation. And so one of the things I look at in that chapter is some people who are doing that. And one, and I'll just hold one up, was a friend of mine named Shelley Newby. And Shelley and I were members of the same Friends meeting in Newcastle, Indiana, which is, as we used to say, 10 miles from any known sin. It's a small town of 20,000 out in East Central Indiana. And Shelley, who was a student at Earlham School of Religion, where I graduated in Richmond, felt a leading, it started as a nudging, that she should walk for peace. that she should walk for peace from Newcastle, Indiana to Washington, D.C. With signs that promoted peace. And at the time, she was 50 years old. She had 3 kids at home. She was not a fitness guru. She tested her leadings with people and then planned with the help of folks and began her walk. But along her walk, there were folks who wanted to join, who wanted to hold protest signs against war. And she invited them to put those down and reword them. And to actually say something positive for peace. Another friend of mine, and I'll use him real quickly, told me this story about when he lived in Sacramento, California, and he would go by the State House all the time, and his friends from meeting were out front protesting against the death penalty, as somebody always did. There was a different religious group every week that was doing that. And so he went to a meeting and said, how can we state this positively so that people might hear our message instead of just react against it? And he said, their meeting came up with a new slogan and a new sign that said, we can all live without the death penalty. We can all live without the death penalty. Just a shift, but in a way that makes it more invitational, because I think that's part of the thing. How do we invite others to our work, to that which we care deeply about? How can we invite people in? It's not easy to think creatively about how to reframe what we're for. But I think it's also more life affirming, more spirit affirming, more uplifting of our souls when we can say what we're for than what we're against. That we are for a woman's right to choose. So how do we say what we're for? One of the closing chapters, which I think is important. Well, of course, I wrote the book, so I think they're all important. Or I wouldn't have spent a year just crafting the words to go into it, is that we have to realize that we can't do everything. Now, one of the things, and this is my personal confession, I would like to do everything. And I often think that I have the skills to do everything. But there are some things that I feel particularly called to, and those are the things I tend to focus on. But as a public friend and a friend who writes, I have a number of friends who are involved in causes about which they care very deeply, and they often encourage me to write more about those things. And at times chastise me because I don't. And one of the things I have to remember is, and we all do, is while I can't do everything, I can support everything. I can support my friends who are called to do that work, but I have to, I'm a man, especially now, of a certain age with certain health conditions, and I have to decide what's mine to do in this season of my life as I have in all my past seasons. And so the query is that I offer friends as we think about this, and this is both individually and corporately as meetings, is what is ours to do? What is mine to do? Not what's good or what's worthy or what's needed. There's so much that is good and worthy and needed. And I also have to say, not what is it that I should do, I mean, again, I have lots of encouragement of shoulds. I grew up, as I said, evangelical friends, so I have lots of voices in my head telling me what I should do. I have a lot telling me what I shouldn't do too. But it really has to go down to, what are we called to do? What are we called? What are you called to do? The Industry and Social Order Conference, hosted by Britain Yearly Meeting, back when it was called London Yearly Meeting, said, incomparably, the most important thing is that each one of us should be sensitive to the call of God to ourselves and not spend time in passing judgment on the lives of others. Our duty is to be sensitive to what God is asking us to do and not dissipate our energies trying to be absolutist in several directions at once. I think that's a powerful statement. And it reminds me, I can't pass judgment on what others are called to do, as I hope they don't pass judgment on what I feel called to do. And even how I do what I'm called to do. The conservation work, I'm very concerned with care of the earth. And so a lot of my work is conservation. I live on a farm that used to be production agriculture, that we've taken out of production agriculture, that is now tall grass prairie and native hardwood trees. In the big scheme of the world, in some ways, it's not that big a thing, but it is for the people in the wildlife in this area, which much of it had disappeared. Tonight, one of my daughters came over with the leftover jack-o'-lanterns from their city house and put out at the edge of our woods where the deer come to visit every night, and bring their babies to eat it. And the raccoons will enjoy it, and the opossums will enjoy it as well. And my farm cats will hide under the porch for a while with all those critters coming. But a test for me, and I've listed some of these in the book about what's mine to do, or what's ours as a society of friends, or even ours as a local meeting, is where's this leading coming from? Is it coming from my ego? Do I have a clear sense, is another one, of what it is I'm called to do? Or is it just something kind of vague? One of my, as some of my friends know, I'm a big Charlie Brown, Peanuts, Snoopy fan. And there's a wonderful picture of Snoopy sitting in the cold, shivering, snow coming down. And Charlie Brown and Linus Van Pelt, sans his blanket, are walking around. They're all bundled up and they're nice and warm. And they go, oh, look at poor Snoopy. He's cold, he's miserable. We should do something about it. And so their solution, because it's not clear, is they go over and they pat him on the head and they go, be of good cheer, Snoopy, be of good cheer. Well, that's hardly a clear leading. It's a nice vague, I feel good because I feel like I'm going to do something. But is it clear? And is it compelling? Another test for me is, how does it fit with my life and faith at this time? My understanding. A big one, as I mentioned earlier, is does it come from God's love? Another chance, or another query that I ask, another test, is, how's it going to change me? If I expect to transform the world, how am I going to be transformed? And then finally, the old Quakers used to talk about what's getting sifted. What chaff is going to blow away and leave the kernel of what is mine to do. And I think there are some sensations, some signs that tell us what ours one is love. Does it warm our hearts and souls, the idea of doing this work? Does it pump some energy into us? Does it tender our hearts? Or is it something we feel like we must grit our teeth and do because of obligation? If it's the latter, if that sensation is coming, perhaps that's not ours to do. Because I think the other is it will tender. Another is there beauty in it? Are we going to be creating something beautiful or turning something ugly into something beautiful? Is it a leading that keeps hanging on, persistence? And is there a feeling of rightness? And then is there a feeling that we're in harmony with the divine? How does it fit with our understanding of the Spirit? The Presbyterian minister and writer Frederick Buechner once wrote, "The vocation for you is the one in which your deep gladness and the world's deep need meet. Something that not only makes you happy, but that the world needs done." Something that not only makes you happy, but that the world needs done. And the last chapter is on, so where's the hope? Where's the hope in this weary world, this troubled world? And I think the hope lies in a number of things, or lays. I'm not that good at grammar. That's why I have an editor always. But I always go back to this quote of George Fox, written at the height of the early persecution, when he's writing an epistle to friends in England, many of whom were in prison, and he writes, "Sing and rejoice, ye children of the day and of the night, ye children of the day and of the light, for the Lord is at work in this thick night of darkness that may be felt." The darkness that may be felt. There's certainly been times in the last year and a half I've felt that darkness between COVID and my wife's stroke. There seems to have been a real cloak of darkness around. "But truth doth flourish as the rose," he writes, "and the lilies do grow among the thorns, and lambs atop and plants atop the hills, and upon them the lambs doth skip and play, and never heed the tempest or the storms, nor floods nor rains. For the seed Christ is over all, and doth reign, and so be of good faith and valiant for the truth." We believe as friends in continuing revelation and the continuing work of the Spirit. And in some ways, I believe that is the Quaker version of the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, which is Hebrew for world repair. The Mishnah defines it as working with God in the redemption of the world. That we are invited into working with the Spirit, working with God, the divine, however you want to phrase it, in the redemption of the world. And so we should sing and rejoice because God is at work, Spirit is at work. And in that we have hope. And then, as Fox again says, and I love this quote, "Be patterns, be examples in all countries, places, islands, nations, wherever you come, that your carriage and life may preach among all sorts of people and to them. And then you will come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God and everyone." And I will close with, because I find poems are often my prayers these days, and have been for a long time. But I open the book with a poem, "Citizen of Dark Times" by Kim Stafford. "Agenda in a time of fear. Be not afraid. When things go wrong, do right. Set out by the half-light of the seeker, for the well-lit problem begins to heal. Learn tropism towards the difficult. We have not arrived to explain, but to sing. Young idealism ripens into an ethical life. Prune back regret to let faith grow. When you hit rock bottom, dig farther down. Grief is the seed of singing, shame the seed of song. Keep seeing what you are not saying. Plunder your reticence. Songbird guards a twig. Its only weapon, a song. Well, thanks for listening to me, and let Lena do some moderating, and we'll see if there are questions or comments, or since there are more than 2 or 3 Quakers here, I'm sure there'll be rebuttals.
Thank you, Brent. So yes, please submit questions to me in the chat. And Brent, could you perhaps type in the chat? I think as a co-host, you could type to everyone the title and author of that poem is one request. And while Brent is doing that, if folks could submit questions to me, I'll let those come in, look for themes, and then we'll share some aloud for Brent to respond to. Wonderful, great. We have a couple here coming in. Invite you to keep sending those in. Often we find we don't have time for every question, but please submit them as you think of them, and we'll try to get to as many as you can. All right. So one theme that's sort of coming together in these questions is you spoke both to moving from a place of love, but also to imperfection and humility and our blind spots.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, Brent, if you could speak, perhaps even give some examples, if you can, around what does moving from a place of love look like when we can't fully disentangle ourselves or our viewpoints from our particular place in time? Do you believe we can locate a stable idea of what a place of love looks like when, of course, we look back and Quakers working with good intentions have supported oppressive systems?
I mean, I think it's really difficult, and one of the things we have to do, I think finding the place of love is always in the sense of testing. Once again, is how am I doing? Asking ourselves, examination. How am I handling the work that I am in? Would folks perceive me as being a loving person, which loving doesn't mean weak and being walked over, but that they see that I care not just about the cause, but about people, including, which is the hardest part, those who are in opposition to what we're for. As I mentioned earlier, John and Diana Lampin's work in Northern Ireland, the whole thing of the people were willing to work with them to help ease the troubles because they saw they cared about them. A friend of mine who's sadly passed away, the civil rights activist Will Campbell, and not enough people know his name anymore, but he got fired as chaplain of the University of Mississippi because he invited a Black person to speak at chapel back in the day. And he went on to be a lifelong civil rights worker, but he was also friends he felt he had to be friends with people in the KKK. And he had to spend time with them and understand them and know them. That I don't know that I could do that. But he felt caught that was his call to show love. He witnessed his faith to them. They knew where he stood, but he was constantly testing, am I really living up to my understanding of the gospel as a gospel of love for all people? And so part of that is a test for me is always, am I able to see that of God in other people? And if I can't speak to that, then perhaps I need to step back some. And I've had to learn to do that in my writings. I am a writer. So a lot of my activism is written, letters to senators, congressmen, helping our meeting craft minutes and so forth. But are there ways that I can try and speak to that of God in them in such a way that perhaps they can hear it? And if I can't do that, then I can't write that letter yet, or I can't help draft that minute until I can get to that place. And once again, understanding too that I have my limited focus, both because of who I am as a person who grew up at a certain time in a certain age, in certain societal norms that I am working through, and we all are working through those. Mm-hmm. And so, how do I continue to test against that and be saying and admit the great African American writer Howard Thurman is said to have ended his sermons by saying, "It may be so. I hope so. God help me if it's not." Well, yeah, that's a pretty humble way to keep yourself centered and realize I might be part of the problem. And maybe I did get it wrong. But trying to act as best I can in this time out of love, but constantly having to test that. So I don't know if that's a very good answer, but it's really how I wrestle with that.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. Some other questions coming in. Thank you for folks who keep sending them. Please do. One question is about how do you feel it's important to balance both personal and communal discernment in our faith practice, particularly in regards to hope?
Could you say it again?
Yeah, and I'll see if I can say it another way. Do you feel that there is a dynamic relationship between personal and communal discernment, particularly in regards to maintaining hope?
Yeah, I do. Of course, that's the trouble with a yes or no question. Mm-hmm. Yes. And now let's move on. No, I mean, I think that's part of it is figuring out, and that's why Rhiannon Grant's quote about, we are not do it ourselves, we're not do it yourself. we're do it ourselves, that we need the communal to balance. And for one, the communal, I think, can give us hope, both in the sense that we are part of a community that really cares deeply about transforming the world and working for the redemption of the world with God, but also in that a communal a group of faith can also encourage us that our small things are doing more good than what we realize as individuals. So I may have discerned that planting 10 acres of tall grass prairie is really important, and 40 acres of hardwood trees. But there are days, especially when I'm out trimming branches or cutting firewood, I think, am I making any difference other than, the field that's next to us is still production agriculture, and there's all kinds of chemicals get dumped on it. And so the trees and the prairie we put up filter all that fertilizer out before it hits the creek, which is part of our watershed area. So it makes the creek safe again. But then I hear people, I get calls from, the people at our meeting who support me in this work, including the farmers who have, many of them have moved to no-till and different sorts of conservation practices. At least I have perhaps a little nudge that I've helped some, and they encourage me. And likewise, in our community of faith, a person can come in our meeting with a discernment about a way that we can make a difference in our meeting in the community. And so it may, besides just giving money, which our meeting has, even though we're small, has a fair amount of money. But so one of our big movements has been to be involved with the local elementary school. And as I describe in the book how we went through that discernment process about what was ours to do as far as working with that particular little school that's just down the street from us.
Thank you, Brent. There's a note here from John Meyer, who
Hi,
expands on this question about blind spots, about community and things. And John says, our blind spots cannot always be resolved by self-reflection. It takes a community, as you mentioned, but sometimes our community is too small, too homogeneous for us to see our blind spots.
Yes.
What examples could you speak to about challenging those situations? And John goes on to say, Woolman's visit to Lenape-Hoking suggests that Woolman knew that he needed to seek beyond his immediate community of friends in that work, which perhaps is an assumption, but certainly an example.
Yeah, well, and I would, if we want to do another kind of moment in history when friends realized that, I talked about the visit to Germany by what Goebbels termed the three wise men, these Quakers who were going to go. They didn't go without consulting the Jewish community in the United States. They may have thought, well, we know what they need, but they went to the Jewish community in the United States and talked to Jewish leaders about, if we were to go, we're feeling this leading, what should we do? What you think would be most helpful, instead of just assuming. And I think that that's part of it, is realize that we need voices that may be outside our community. Certainly our community can help feed that, but my immediate faith community is primarily a bunch of rural white people in Indiana. We are very diverse theologically and politically, but we're not racially or in other ways, and we know that. So we have to go outside when we're looking for how we can make the biggest impact. And so I talked about the school that we decided to help. We didn't just decide to do that. We talked to the school and said, okay, here's this group of people. We care about the community. What do you think we could do that would be really helpful to you? And we're in a food desert, and most of the kids are on, meal programs. So there were all kinds of ideas they had. And there were some things we couldn't do, but we had space in our meeting room or our meeting house. And one was a local clothing closet that became a Girl Scout project to run a clothing project for the kids in that school to have clothing there. But we went to the school and asked them. And so I would say with any activism, if we're thinking about working, we need to talk to the people we think we want to help, and not do it from this, well, we know what they need kind of thing. And so that means we have to go outside our community, outside the religious society of friends, if that's what it takes. Don't assume we know. And I'm afraid we friends at times are too insular that way, even as the religious society of friends, even as Friends General Conference or Friends United meeting, that we think we have this Quaker exceptionalism that we are different than other religious groups or whatever, and it blinds us at times to asking for advice in the sense of what is needed in this world, and what advice would you give us for how to, if we undertake peace work, if we undertake equity work, what can we learn from you, the communities that we would like to be involved with?
Thank you. A couple more questions coming in. One question is, what keeps you grounded and in hope?
Well, part of it is that George Fox quote. I think it sounds almost psalm-like about sing and rejoice, ye children of the day and of the light. Reminding myself that I am a child of the light, as the early friends would say, that I see how my life has been transformed by Quaker faith and practice, not as a theoretical exercise, or not because I am somehow naturally inclined towards Quakerism, but because it's what I need and how it's improved my own personal life. A friend, shortly after I wrote Holy Silence, The Gift of Quaker Spirituality, they were saying, well, I'm of course you're attracted to silence. You're a Quaker and you all do that. It's like, yeah, I'm a naturally noisy person. Just ask all my friends. I need this constant call back to the silence and the grounding. I need the constant call to consider, what does it mean to live a simple life? What does it mean if I say I believe in equality of all people? How do I have to live that then out? Those questions keep me grounded as I examine them through the lens of my faith. And I do try to practice, especially certain things that, one of the things that I've fallen out of lately and I'm just starting to get back in because I've got a little bit more time, is praying with my camera, is what I call it, is taking my really good camera out into the woods and tramping around and looking for things and practicing mindfulness through looking for a lens shot that just grounds me in that there's kind of all this wonder and beauty around me, but there's also some ugliness that can be redeemed by turning it into an art exercise. And so that may sound real simple, but practicing daily silence and then praying with my camera are two just things that really help ground me a lot.
Thank you for that, Brent. I will share one of my own questions because you opened the door by shouting out equate. For folks who I was introduced to Quakerism through equate now over 10 years ago, which is wild. I served on the board of equate for 7.5 years and as co-clerk of the board for 2.5 years. And as you were speaking about how we test if spirit is present, if love is the first motion, you gave sort of some examples of feedback you might receive that help you to know if where leading may be coming from, if you should follow this course of action. And I wanted to share a quick story just to get to the question. In the Bank Like Appalachia Matters campaign, the PNC Bank campaign, where we're asking PNC Bank to stop funding mountaintop removal coal mining, one of the tactics that we took on was to spotlight individual executives who worked at PNC Bank. Sometimes that meant showing up at public events where they were being honored and worshiping through disrupting those events. Sometimes that meant showing up in other parts of their private life. And there was quite a bit of controversy within Equate about those tactics as we were choosing them. And I remember very vividly some folks walking away because they did not feel that those tactics came from a place of love. And part of why we moved forward was this clarity that when systems are unjust and we are people within systems, part of love sometimes is believing people can do things differently, and loving the wholeness of what someone is capable of, including making a different decision. And that was the spirit by which we approached some of these executives. And the question I have is about quaking. And it's about when a calling feels spirit-led, but that leading leaves us fearful or nervous or stretched. We might break a norm. We might, our love may take us outside the boundaries of what's socially acceptable. And I'm curious about what you've done or what you've seen Quakers do when leadings come into conflict with those systems, or when love may call us into those difficult places, may call us into controversy with our peers. What you see as a tool in those moments.
Well, thanks for that nice, easy question. I think you brought up something that is really thorny, and I want to say, in case I didn't make it clear, that I don't think the way of love means being nice. Too often the sin of niceness has hampered us both individually and corporately from speaking truth, even in situations as difficult as meeting conflict, or knowing how and when to elder someone who seems to be. Why we assume that being loving means that you can't elder someone. I think a lot of it has to do with, for me, really has to do with tone, and how can I, even doing something hard and challenging someone, perhaps to live up to the light that I hope they can be given, or to encourage them to see deeper into the light. How do they know that I'm not just being critical and kind of something I would never say in my evangelical youth, but just being an SOB about it, And so how do I think about how I can let the executive, if I was called to that work at PNC, know that I don't want to say that this isn't personal, because it is personal, but it's not against them as a human being. It's about what's your light telling you about this. And I think part of me, what I have to do in that situation, and I wonder if I would offer this if I'd been on Equate, is how can we try and find a way to dialogue to say, how at your best, tell me what your experience is that you could support this, that you think this is really fine and okay work with, in light of your own personal values. Help me understand that. And I don't think at times we do enough of that dialogue. Not that we end there, but I think that's how do we invite dialogue, not to keep us from moving, not saying that, but that so there are many times, and maybe this is some of my evangelical upbringing, but there are many times I don't have a whole lot of trouble knowing when I've really screwed up, or maybe am about to, or am heading further down. So I don't need generally somebody to really land on me heavy. But if somebody who I know cares speaks to me in a caring way about it, it's all of a sudden like, yeah, I needed to hear that word. And to live up to that which is my deepest calling and which I feel in my heart. So how can we invite people in our activism work to do that? If we really believe there is that of God, in every person, how do we walk cheerfully across the world answering that of God in those people? It's hard work. And I think in the instance of a group like Equate or any other group, you may reach a decision that some members of the group can't, that doesn't fit their calling, and so they have to step aside. But if that is still the calling of the group, and you really can say, we're doing this out of love, and trying to answer the question, how can we let those we feel we need to confront or disrupt see that we are not just a bunch of hateful people, but there is something sincere and real about us, exuding this deeper power. I don't know if that's making any sense, but I know what I mean. It's just that's part of it for me. I know I can get too angry and too upset too fast, and so a lot of my, that's why I write, is I have to take that step back so I can try and speak in such a way that I can be heard. But that's my call, knowing my limitations. And I think individually and as groups, we have to think, is there something holding us back so that we wouldn't be heard, that we may achieve our objective, but at what cost to our own souls or to that person's soul?
Well, this has sparked a flurry of questions, as you might imagine, in our last 6 minutes. We will not be able to get to all of them, and I'll just name. I hear you, Brent, speaking powerfully to an interpersonal and individual theory of change, and just to name that. Some may know the work of Neonu Span, who speaks of the individual, the group level, and the societal. There are other frameworks of
Yes.
change. And one of the things I'm appreciating is the relatedness of those different levels and the distinctiveness of those different levels. So some of the questions that are coming in relate to when we're dealing with individuals who are in systems, if dialogue is refused, how do we move forward if the goal is to change a system? You know, do we stay at that interpersonal? How do we move? So just to address for our audience, we will not resolve all the theories of change tonight about that dynamic between power and systems and individuals. But just wanted to speak to that. And but there are some questions about scale and harm, and when people are invested in systems that are doing harm, perhaps what comments you may have, Brent, as we move to close, about that discernment of and dance. I know it'll be imperfect, but when we need to challenge systems that are doing harm, what that dynamic can look like.
Yeah, and I don't think I can paint a picture of what that dynamic looks like, because it is something I think that calls for constant discernment and constant reflection, both as we as individuals and as groups, to say, are we engaging in the best possible ways, in ways that are needed. It's not to step back and just say, well, we've got to talk this out with individuals all the time. I think in many ways, though, we often move forward without hearing the other. We hear the other that we support, but not the other who's in opposition, and not to hear them so that we agree, but so that we can maybe hear what's an approach that we can use to get through to them in the systems they work in. Now, there are some systems we're just going to have to try and shut down. I'm not saying that, not that at all. But how do we do it in such a way that demonstrates that our lives are love and peace and integrity and community, that we are children of the light, even while we go about hard work. I mean, one of my friends who has done a lot of work against systemic oppression is Noel Stuckey from Peter, Paul, and Mary. They were always getting arrested and had this great song, "Have You Been to Jail for Justice?" And he always smiles at me when he sings that, because he knows I haven't. And it's not been my call at this point. And in this stage of my life, I can't, because of all these health conditions, for one. But it is his, and he approaches it differently than I do, and he works with organizations that approach it differently. And I think that's part of it, is what is ours to do and how are we to do it. And we have to continually ask that at whatever level we are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Brent. Just some light questions at the end, I know.
Yes.
I want to invite us to take a breath, and just in this final moment, if anything rises you want to say, Brent, as a final remark, we'll move to close.
Well, the only thing I'd like to say in closing is, well, there are a couple. One is, I really appreciate folks taking time to come together and to care about this. hope and witness in dangerous times. And also something I try and say always in person. I didn't say it this time, but I'm no expert in this. These are these are my offerings, and if they're helpful, which is my hope, then wonderful. If there's something in it that you can take away that is helpful to you, then that's a blessing to me. But by no means am I speaking as some kind of expert or anything else. It's a fellow pilgrim to my other fellow pilgrims as we walk this way of what it means to be children of light in an age that often seems dark, which it always has for people of faith, no matter what time, what decade, what century. It's always dangerous times for people of spiritual life and of faith.
Thank you, Brent. And thank you all for being with us. As we come to a close, I invite you to consider joining us next month for our first Monday lecture, which will be on the first Monday of December 6th. That will be with Reverend Retta Morgan, Into the Night, the Holiness of Darkness. So some dialogue here